In this explainer, we're breaking down the 2026 Iran war, and we're going to focus on a question that is absolutely critical for any student of international relations. How did decades of shadowboxing and proxy fighting suddenly explode into direct, state-on-state warfare?
It all comes down to this one date, February 28, 2026. This is the day the unspoken rules that governed the Middle East for generations were just shattered. For almost 75 years, the conflict between Iran, the US, and Israel was fought indirectly, through proxies, through cyber attacks, through sanctions. But on this day, that all came to a sudden and violent end.
And this was the official line right out of the White House. President Trump's statement framed the whole thing not as a choice, but as a necessity, a defensive move. The key phrase here is imminent threat. That language really set the stage for what would become one of the biggest military showdowns of the 21st century. So, let's dive right into the opening moments of the war. They called it Operation Epic Fury. It kicked off with a massive, coordinated air assault by the United States and Israel, and the targets were incredibly strategic. They were aiming for what you'd call a decapitation strike, hitting Iran's nuclear program, its missile sites, and, crucially, its senior leadership. And in a move that absolutely stunned the world, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed. Now, Iran's response was fast. We're talking within hours. A huge barrage of missiles and drones screamed towards American military bases across the region and at targets inside Israel. The shadow war was over. The real war had begun. And just to give you a sense of the sheer scale of this thing, we're talking about nearly 900 combined strikes on day one alone. I mean, this was not a warning shot. This was a clear, overwhelming attempt to cripple Iran's entire military and command structure from the get-go. Okay, so to really get how we reached this point, we have to rewind the clock. This war didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was born from a long, bitter history of indirect fighting, the so-called shadow war. The roots here run deep. You could argue it really all starts back in 1953 with that US-backed coup that installed the Shah. That bred a resentment that finally just boiled over in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And from that moment on, Iran's new government basically defined itself as an enemy of the US and Israel. Then, you have the discovery of its secret nuclear program in 2002, which kicked off this whole new era of sanctions and cyber warfare. And of course, the 2020 assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, that really showed just how thin the line between shadow and open war had become. For anyone analyzing policy, this slide is absolutely key. It's all about the shift in the rules of engagement. See, the old game? That was played with proxies, like Hezbollah, with deniable cyber attacks and economic pressure. The new game? It's direct. It's unambiguous. We're talking missile strikes between countries, openly targeting heads of state, and totally disrupting the global economy. The goals are now out in the open. Either change the regime or completely destroy its ability to fight. Now, this jump from the old rules to the new ones didn't happen overnight. It was the result of a really rapid escalation spiral in the couple of years leading right up to the war. The first real domino to fall was the Gaza War in late 2023. That just lit a fire under proxy attacks across the entire region. But then, in 2024, a major line was crossed. Iran and Israel fired missiles directly at each other's territory, for the first time ever. The whole situation got way more intense in June 2025, with the 12-day war, where both Israel and the US hit Iran's nuclear sites. And the final piece of the puzzle was internal. Massive anti-government protests swept across Iran in early 2026, and they shook the regime to its absolute core. And the regime's response to those protests was just brutal. Some non-government sources put the death toll as high as 32,000. Now, that's a strategically huge number. Why? Because it shows the incredible pressure the Iranian government was under at home. They were fighting for their own survival, which created this perception of vulnerability, right when all the external pressure was hitting a boiling point. So this brings us to the central strategic question, right? Why did the US and Israel decide to flip the switch, to go from a decades-long strategy of containment and shadow war to all-out direct military confrontation at this exact moment? I mean, what was the thinking here? Why risk a massive regional war that could absolutely crater the world economy? What changed? Well, it really seems to be a perfect storm of factors. First, there was this perception that Iran was weak. The regime was getting hammered by the biggest protests it had seen since the revolution, and its key proxy forces had taken a beating. Second, its own defenses were already softened up by those earlier strikes in 2024 and 25. And third, diplomacy was just seen as a complete dead end. International inspectors were reporting that Iran was on the very brink of getting a nuclear weapon. You put all that together, and decision makers in Washington and Jerusalem saw what they believed was a very risky but very unique window of opportunity. And this reporting seems to point to the final trigger. The feeling was that an Israeli strike was going to happen no matter what. So the strategic thinking in Washington apparently shifted. The new calculation became, if a war is inevitable, it's better for the U.S. to be involved from the very start, to control the outcome and, well, make sure it succeeded.
So the war began, and its consequences were immediate. They were far-reaching, and they kicked off a really dangerous new era of conflict for the entire Middle East.
The most immediate global impact came down to one tiny choke point on the map, the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, this narrow channel is basically the artery for about a fifth of the entire planet's oil supply. And as soon as the war kicked off, Iran used its control over this waterway as its biggest weapon against the global economy. And the effects hit instantly. By messing with traffic through the strait, Iran triggered a global energy crisis. The war also spilled over its borders almost immediately, reigniting the war in Lebanon and activating its remaining proxy forces. And inside Iran, with Ali Khamenei gone, his son, Mojtaba, was quickly made the new supreme leader, which pretty much guaranteed the regime would stick to its hardline position.
But as the fighting went on, a really critical difference in strategies started to show. Israel's stated goal was pretty clear: regime change, to permanently end the threat. The United States, on the other hand, was publicly focused on something more limited: destroying Iran's military capabilities. This difference between full-on regime change and just capability destruction is a classic strategic problem, and it became a major source of tension in the alliance as the war dragged on.
And that leaves us with the critical question moving forward. The unwritten rules of that 70-year shadow war have been totally erased. They're gone. So in this new era of direct, high-tech, state-on-state warfare, what are the new rules going to be? And maybe more importantly, who's going to get to write them?